politics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by Cleveland area attorney and Republican factotum Jay Carson. Hey, Jay.
Hey, good morning, Mike.
Yeah, I don't know why I said your name like that, Jay Carson. It was kind of like a big intro there.
Yeah.
A lot to live up to there anyway. Yeah. But how are you doing today?
Well, I'll tell you, as I relayed earlier, for some reason I completely overslept and got up by, with like just 10 minutes before we were supposed to start recording. So I would describe myself as awake but not woke.
Okay. I like that. Yeah, definitely not woke. All right. Well, before we do get started, just a few quick things. First off, we want to thank our newest Patreon supporters, Kristen D, Elliot, NDR 3AS, and that's obviously a screen name, I would assume, but thank you. Peter, Jordan, and Mitchell. And Elliot wrote in to tell us that I'm glad there's an outlet for serious political discussion and not the hysteria of other political news sources. Keep up the good work. And I know sometimes people would say, well, occasionally Mike maybe ventures a little into the hysteria end, but Jay tends to pull me back. So it's good, I guess. And Kirk also said that he appreciates the view from both sides. And of course, as a Patreon supporter, you get, that second full-length episode every week and ad-free versions of all our shows at some point when buyers are actually buying ads on shows, and we have them as well as various other things. But, a few days ago, one of our key supporters wrote to say, while patron exclusive content is great, the reason he supports the show is not in exchange for more stuff, but because he cares about what we're trying to do, civil, bipartisan discussion. He knows how little of it is there is out there, and he wants to do his part to keep it going. And it's because of supporters like him, and you know who you are, we can still manage to give access to all of our shows to people who, find what we're doing valuable, but aren't currently in a position to support the show financially. And if that's you, please send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will make sure to get you set up with access to everything that we put out. And for everyone else, to become a sustaining supporter, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys, or to make a one-time pledge of support through PayPal, you can go to politicsguys.com/support and click on the PayPal link you'll find there. And Jay, mostly we have U.S. listeners, but around 15% of our audience is from outside of the United States. And that's kind of cool. A lot of UK people especially. And I want to let those listeners know, all of you, that Patreon recently made a change that allows you to support the show in British pounds or euros, which means that there are none of those weird foreign currency fees if you've been converting from pounds or euros to US dollars. So there's that, which is nice. And then finally, we are going to be not exactly taking off next week, but we're going to be doing something a little bit different next week. In place of our Saturday, August 15th show will be an interview I recently did with political scientists Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson. And they've collaborated on a number of books over the years, all of which I've read and many of which I've assigned in my classes with the sort of disclaimer to the students that this is a left of center view. And then we talk about, that and so forth, because I do not, at least I try not to indoctrinate in my classes, certainly. But their latest book is called Let Them Eat Tweets, How the Right Rules in an Age of Extreme Inequality. Now, despite the sound of the title, it's not a Trump-focused, Trump-bashing book. And in the book, I think they make a number of really good points, though I definitely don't agree with all of their premises or all of their conclusions. And Jay had a chance to listen to the interview as well. And what we're going to do is after the interview, there'll be some discussion between us about various parts of it and to get in a more conservative viewpoint. And I think that'll be a really worthwhile thing, and you should get a lot out of it. And I was glad. I've had Jacob Hacker on the show a number of times and finally got the full team on. And I thought it was a really interesting interview. So that's going to be Saturday the 15th. Then on Wednesday the 19th will be my interview with Ohio Supreme Court Justice Michael Donnelly. And Justice Donnelly and I talked about, the Michael Flynn case and legal fictions, kind of interesting thing, and also Paul Manafort and issues with sentencing, making the plea negotiation process fully transparent. And the really kind of, I would say, sort of radical thing Justice Donnelly did when he was a trial court judge to make the process entirely transparent, and also a bunch of other things like sentencing databases and so forth. There was, I wasn't sure what to expect from it, but he was a great guy. It was a fascinating conversation that I think has implications, really nationally. It's not just an Ohio thing, even though he's an Ohio Supreme Court justice. So yeah, and I know, Jay, you think very highly of Justice Donnelly as well.
Yeah, no, Mike. I've known Justice Donnelly for probably 15, 20 years, and actually we live in the same town. And I see him and talk to him at events. Well, used to. I mean, when we had events. But no, he is a great guy, and I for all the folks and all the heat that I take, and I see one of the viewer questions that we'll be answering later is, have ever voted for a Democrat? And the answer is, of course. I mean, our Ohio Supreme Court is elected on you have a party. Well, it's technically in the general election, they're not partisan, but Michael Donnelly was the Democratic nominee for a Supreme Court seat, and I was happy to vote for him because he's a good judge, great guy, smart guy, and really works to do the right thing. So yeah, I think that was great that we got him on. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I want to mention also that both of these episodes will be freely available to everyone. So both the Saturday and the midweek episode. And then the next week after that, we'll be back on our regular schedule. And of course, if something colossal should happen between August 8th today, when we're recording, and the 15th, we can always do a special emergency episode. And let's just hope
we'll be there for you.
Yeah, America. Exactly. Anyway, with all that out of the way, let's get to our first story of the day, and that's negotiations between House Democratic leadership and the White House on additional coronavirus relief have collapsed, and President Trump has said he plans to act unilaterally by issuing executive orders to resume lapsed federal unemployment benefits, reinstate an expired moratorium on evictions, extend the suspension of student loan payments, and defer collection of federal payroll taxes. Now, three main points of contention here seem to be, but in the negotiations, were the amount of unemployment benefits, which Democrats wanted to keep at $600 per week, with the White House countering with $400, aid to state and local governments, with Democrats calling for nearly $1 trillion and the White House offering $200 billion, and liability protection for businesses. Now, there's no mention of liability protection in the House's HEROES Act, which passed on May 15th. But Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has repeatedly emphasized that legislation without strong liability protection would be dead on arrival in the Senate. And of those three things, it seems like the real sticking point was the aid to state and local government, reportedly the issue where there was just not a whole lot of room for compromise. And so what this means, at least in the short run, is, of course, a longer and possibly permanent expiration of those additional jobless benefits, schools not getting the $100 billion or more to help with opening and operating under pandemic conditions, and that was something there was actually bipartisan agreement on. No additional funding for virus testing, as cases seem to be rising in a lot of instances, and no relief for state and local government. So all in all, it seems to me that this is a pretty significant failure of government. A lot to talk about here, Jay. I thought maybe we could start with those things separating the parties and then get into the whole issue of the constitutionality and wisdom of the president's proposed executive orders, if that's okay. So let's start with those extended unemployment benefits. What do you think about the positions there? What's your view on this?
As I had read, or this is earlier reporting of these, the $600 a week additional benefit. The issue that concerns many Republicans, I think many people across the country, is according to some estimates, roughly 5 out of 6 people would be making more under the with the enhanced benefits than they would had they been working at their prior job. This is a little bit of a weird recession in that in some cases, not all cases, but in many cases, this isn't a matter of jobs have been destroyed, jobs have been lost. The jobs are still there, just the people can't go back to them, or the employer fully intends to ramp back up once demand comes, and the sense is that when there's a vaccine or something else, some other sort of, we reach a point where government says, okay, we've reached enough herd immunity, but whatever, this will all come back. This isn't a business cycle recession. It happened quick, and I think it could turn around quickly based on things that are completely unrelated to economics. So there's that concern is that, listen, if people are looking to bring employees back, but you can't get employees back because they are making the quite rational choice of look, I make more by not working. That's a problem. I think it's a problem, if you want to, I don't put quotes on it, morally. I'd hesitate to say it's a moral issue, but it's what you would call a moral hazard, I guess, right? So I think that's a big issue. Yet, the GOP is still willing to go to 400 in additional benefits. So my sense is that's something that probably gets worked out. And maybe it might take the next step politically to do it, but I think you end up with a compromise there. Because look, Republicans have agreed in principle on the enhanced unemployment benefits, and I think also when push comes to shove on that politically, I think that issue tilts towards Republicans.
When you say that issue tilts toward Republicans, can you just? I'm not clear on what you mean by that.
Yeah, no, I think as things play out, right? If Democrats want to make the political issue of, hey, they are slashing additional jobless benefits to an additional $400 a week, I think that's a losing political case for Democrat House members. That we would say you get an additional $600. Again, this is additional on top of unemployment. It's additional on top of some states provide additional unemployment as well. And so I guess that's the case. I mean, look, if this was a regular recession, you would just be receiving the regular unemployment, which is, again, it would be a big hurt for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But still, this is.
Yeah, I wanted
my sense is I think there's a lot of folks in the public would agree when they say, you know what, people shouldn't make more for not working than they do for working.
Yeah. A couple points there.
I think if the GOP points that out, I think that's a winning argument.
Well, I think it's certainly it's an anecdotal argument that a lot of people are embracing. A lot of folks on the right have regularly, including Treasury Secretary, have pointed to the University of Chicago study that found that 68% of people are making more on the enhanced benefits than they did their jobs. But the authors of that study also point out that doesn't include benefits that people would get with their jobs that they're not getting. And also, the authors of the study pointed out that they found no evidence that the extra money was keeping people from taking jobs. And there are actually also 5 other major studies that have been done that look for any evidence that people are not taking jobs and staying on the unemployment.
I'd agree.
And they found no evidence of that.
With that. Yeah, no. And I would agree 100% with that. But I want to point out the reason in this case with a lot of people, and again, I don't have a study in front of me, but this is just sort of the common sense. In most cases, a lot of people are fully expecting and that, they will return to their own job.
Yeah.
So to the extent that you're saying, well, it's not keeping people from finding new jobs. Yeah, I would agree with that. But going forward, as places start to reopen, and the employer says, hey, would you like to come back to your old job? There are going to be some people who will say, well, yeah, I've got another 6 months of making more money by not working. I'll just sit it out and I'll find something else then.
Well, it wouldn't necessarily.
That is the concern going forward. It's less of a that as the recovery happens, you're not going to have people going back to work because they're better off not going back to work.
Well, I mean, I guess that's an important, I guess that might be a concern down the line. But right now there are somewhere around 5.4 million job openings and around 31 million people on unemployment. And so I think that's like the concern of, of somebody, of the proverbial 98-pound weakling saying, well, I'd lift weights, but I'm just concerned I'll become muscle bound. I think that's looking way too far ahead of things. And of course, one simple way to deal with that is to tie these enhanced benefits not to some arbitrary date in the future, which never made any sense to me. And I don't know why they did that in the CARES Act. I think that was dumb from a policy perspective. They should have tied it to economic indicators like the unemployment rate in states or even in counties, more specifically, because of course that can vary a lot within areas between states. And in fact, that's what a bipartisan group of economists.
That would be terrible. But I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
So tying benefits to economic conditions would be terrible? No, explain to me why you think that would be terrible. I'm interested.
Well, that's shown up in a lot of states. This is pre-pandemic. For example, Illinois, and it depends on how you would draw these districts and how you massage the data. But the state of Illinois, Chicago had tremendous poverty, unemployment issues. But that doesn't mean the rest of the state does. And they sort of imported that data because, Chicago is an 800-pound gorilla in Illinois. That data can bring down the employment rate for the rest of the state, which means, now every place in Illinois qualifies for these additional. And I'm blanking on the program right now. But my concern is that if you do that, there's sort of the self-fulfilling prophecy, right? That unemployment is we'll keep paying you because unemployment isn't going down. But if the reason that unemployment isn't going down is because we keep paying you, that's
except
the
there's
issue,
no evidence that it actually happens, and so you're talking anecdotally, but there's no evidence that it actually happens.
Let's put it this way. I'll ask you a quick question. If your option, and again, you have a pretty good job, and I have a pretty good job, and those are both sort of long-term, career type jobs that you say, yeah, I want to go back to because it's part of who. If you're somebody who works in the service industry, and maybe you work at one restaurant for a while and you don't like it, and maybe you go work for another one. If you're sitting at home and you're saying, well, look, I'm out of work, but I'm getting more than what I did when I was at work. Should I go back? I don't think that's. I don't think you need a study to say that. People will say, I would yes, I'll choose the not working and more money option, over going back and losing money. So and again, I'm not even faulting anybody for that because I think that's the completely rational thing to do. And as stuff starts opening up, I think employers, there's a reasonable concern that people won't come back or won't come back quickly enough if they don't have reason to.
Got it. I see what you're saying. Yeah, and that actually makes sense to me. And as you pointed out earlier, things are different because of the pandemic, and so yeah, I think that's a good point. And I guess I would say that.
Let me put it this way: say you are you work at a restaurant, you're a bartender, whatever, and you're laid off, but now you're getting the unemployment plus you're getting the $600 kicker, and you say, look, you know what? I know Amazon's hiring, but well, hell, why should I go schlub boxes for 8 hours a day when the place I work, the restaurant I work, will probably be back open full service within a couple months, or I can just go find another restaurant that's I can do the same thing within a couple months. So yeah, no thanks. I'll sit here and flatten the curve for you. So that's to me just sort of the common sense sort of.
So you feel like when we have again, this is what the point I was making, because you had me already, but you wanted to go on, but that's fine. But I understood your logic there, and I think there's something to it. But I think the additional part of this is another reason why this is not like a normal recession, a normal major recession, is because the more people we have out, the more transmission we have, and the greater spread, and there are economic and health consequences with that. And so perhaps what I was going to suggest was that maybe tying it to unemployment, but also tying it to still there being a declared state of emergency, health emergency. And maybe that's something that you'd be more comfortable
I suppose
accepting.
that's possible. I mean, if your assumption is that people who aren't going to work are also just staying home and not mingling.
Well, they're mingling less, certainly. And the advice is,
how do you know?
Well, I mean, and the advice is
there's been a lot of.
Well, apparently Trump supporters are, right? Because they're out there, and but I think you can agree that it's better.
If anything, I'd say, hey, I got more money and I got all this time on my hands. I'm going out.
So you think that's how people that's how you think people react?
In some cases, yeah. I think, but I'm saying I don't think if the plan is we're going to increase unemployment benefits because it will keep people at home, I don't think that follows. I don't. I mean, maybe in some cases you say, yeah, well, I guess they're not going to their job. But if they were going to their job and their job required them to wear a mask and required them to do X, Y, and Z and all these things, but in their private life they might be less responsible about those things. I don't know that there's a straight line that says paying people to stay home prevents the spread of the virus.
So there's certainly a relationship between people not being out as much and less spread.
Sure. No, absolutely.
Yeah. And
but I guess my point is, these people might not be out at work, but they might be out somewhere.
They might, sure, absolutely.
And
but they wouldn't have to be.
If they were out at work, they would be required to follow certain protocols, in most responsible places. But you wouldn't necessarily have that if they're Mike, I bring this up because there was an interesting question that's come up in Ohio about keeping bars open. The governor put on an order saying that bars have to stop serving liquor after 10 p.m. And a number of bar owners have sued, saying, look, this is arbitrary and capricious, and a lot of our business comes after 10 p.m. Now, setting aside the merits of the argument, someone I had talked to, a bar owner, made the point to me that, look, the people who go after 10 p.m., a lot of them are service industry folks, and if they're going to drink somewhere, and if they're not going to a bar, they're going to go to a house party. And if they go to the bar or the restaurant, well, then they're going to have tables should be set 6 feet apart, and there's going to be some level of social distancing and mask wearing and all that kind of stuff.
It's a pretty ridiculous argument.
Why not?
It's like saying, let's legalize all drugs because, people are going to do them. And so we might as well just make it safe and at home. It's, no, that's just not the case. If there are fewer opportunities, a lot of people will just say drink at home, or some people won't drink. And so, I understand it's a very self-serving argument, but I don't think it's a very good one.
Have you ever worked in the service industry?
Yeah.
Well, look, you know that people, you go out afterwards. And I think, look, it's difficult to quantify, but my point is paying people not to go to work doesn't mean that they're not going to go someplace else. That's what I'm.
I agree. Yeah, it's not sure. Absolutely.
So if the goal is saying, listen, we're going to pay people not to go to work because there's this other benefit in terms of preventing the spread, I just don't think that argument has legs.
I think there are two things that the $600 is trying to do. Number one, It's in part, yes, trying to keep people maybe not to go to work for health reasons, but also it's trying to keep people afloat when there just aren't that many jobs out there. And I think that those are two very reasons. Now, that all being said, you and I maybe would disagree on the amount and so forth. This bipartisan commission of economists I mentioned suggested that a reasonable compromise would be $400 a week. And, I think that would be a reasonable compromise. And actually, I think that in a better world, there would be a legislation that would be passed specifically on that. And that's actually something that I'll give Republicans credit. They were willing to do, and House Democrats said we're not willing to do just a small single thing. We want to hold out for this larger package. And I think that while politically I get that, I think from a policy perspective and from taking care of people, I think at least in the short term, that's not the right thing to do. Though longer term, I know the argument is, well, that's better for people longer term if we can just hold out. But then it becomes kind of a game of chicken that you're playing with people's health and livelihoods. And I have a real problem with that. So there's that.
All right. So we're agreed that we'd both be okay with 400.
If I were in Congress, I would push for. I would certainly, at this point, with the negotiations having broken down, I would want to see a bill that just has extension of the benefits, and I'd happily vote for $400. Absolutely.
Okay. And let me, I can, because Mike, my mind is so facile. I can hold contradicting arguments at the same time. Was that Melville who said that? But anyway, the argument for additional money, I think, is one that you didn't make. And that is sort of the stimulus effect.
Yeah, and there's been
that I think there's something there too.
Studies have found that. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a balancing between that stimulus effect and the not going back to work effect.
Yeah.
And I think $400 is again, none of these things are going to be exact, but I think if that I think the other point of this, I know we've talked about this a lot, but is there sends a message, right? That, look, this is a temporary thing and it's going to go away, right? This is not the new way of life. So $600 in the initial part of the pandemic, as things begin to reopen, we're stepping this back to $400. And then, eventually that'll expire. And hopefully by that time, we've got a recovery going on. So.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, our policy about fighting the pandemic and recovery seems to be mostly, hopefully, it'll go away, but that's a whole other story. Anyway, let's move on to that second part, aid to state and local governments. My take is that I can see where House and Senate Republicans in the White House might balk a little bit at $1 trillion or right around $1 trillion. But, I've seen a lot of estimates on this, and a couple that I've seen actually peg the losses to state and local, just to state governments that are only COVID related around a little over $500 billion. And that doesn't, of course, include the 89,000 local governments in the U.S., many of which are also losing money. And the CARES Act, which was that original legislation, that provided $150 billion. White House negotiators say, well, we'd be offering $200 billion. I think a reasonable compromise here would be around $400 billion. I was wondering what you thought.
I would agree that I think aid to state and local governments ought to be part of the package. The concern, and I think this is I think it's not an unfounded concern, is that this is just a payoff to other governments, and there's sort of the if what the other side, if no matter what the problem is, the solution is always the same, then that makes one skeptical. So if the answer is always we need more money for state and local governments, that's reason for skepticism.
Well, I think that's an unfair argument because, right now, I get what you're saying, and I understand the Republican talking point on this. They're going to use it to bail out their pension systems and all
pensions,
that sort of thing. But the fact of the matter is we know that tax revenues are way, way down for, the reason that we put ourselves into this
Sure.
lockdown for health reasons. And so this isn't just, they were being irresponsible. This is all, a worldwide pandemic hit. And this was something that no state government.
There's almost a conservative takings kind of argument, right? There.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I can see that. So I'm saying I think it should be part of the package.
Okay.
But I think, maybe the way to do it, and I think this will come out in negotiations, is to try to link it to those actual tax losses. We talked about this in the original.
Well, yeah, and the problem with that is the money's kind of fungible,
the concern
right?
is that places that were broke in the first place shouldn't get a. I mean, it's almost exactly the same as the unemployment argument we just had. I mean, you shouldn't. Be in a better position than you were because of the
I see what you're saying. Sure, and you can probably do some sort of state by state calculation of what their predicted revenues were and what their cost to deal directly with COVID were, and base it on that. Yeah, I'd absolutely be for that. No question.
Yeah, and I think that would give Republicans some cover to say, listen, we are making sure that state and local governments are receiving the money they need to continue to provide essential services and pay first responders and all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
We
actually agree on that.
At the same time, it's not a windfall, and hey, we're going to use this to bail out our pensions, or to just make state and local government bigger.
Okay, yeah, you and I essentially we could work that out ourselves, no question. All right.
We'll do the numbers and get them to Mitch.
Yeah, definitely. And then finally, liability protection. And now on this, I agree that liability protection is important. And I think the fact that it wasn't included in the House legislation that passed in mid-May is a problem. But I would also argue that a number of states have already have liability protections, and many are currently working on additional COVID-related protections. And also that this is traditionally very much a state level thing. And so what Republicans, the party of, federalism, are proposing is a federalization of tort law. And I think that's a pretty big deal here. And I kind of wanted to get your take on that.
Actually, this is, again, one, I do believe that the immunity is a big piece of this, and it's absolutely needed. Second, my preference would be for state immunity bills.
Yeah.
For those very reasons that you said, most of these cases ought to be brought in state court. Third, to the extent that a federal bill would be needed, and look, I think that's the argument for a federal immunity is it covers everybody, and it's uniform. Everybody knows what it is. It's the same argument that everybody uses for we ought to do this federally because it's the same and fixes the problem in one fell swoop.
On that point, Jay, before you go on, I wanted to point out that I absolutely agree. I think there's a lot to be said for the uniformity argument, but it's also worth pointing out that the Senate Republican version, while it preempts state liability protections, it only does so if they're less favorable to businesses than their proposed law. So it's really not. They're not. This isn't about uniformity.
It's the floor,
in this case.
Floor, not a ceiling.
Yeah.
So I look. I think that's important. I don't know what the count is right now in terms of states that have passed liability protections or not. But I mean, look. I think it's. Let's put it this way. I think it's not an unreasonable ask.
No, I know
to do that, and again, as much as I love federalism in this time of emergency, I could see the exception being, look, but this is something different, and this is something that would affect interstate commerce, and and it depends on how you write it too.
Yeah, and another thing
again, also just to be clear, this wouldn't be in any of these versions. It wouldn't be a unqualified pure immunity. It would be.
And I mean, and that's the point I wanted to make. In reading the details of the Senate Republican bill, it would be pretty much complete, and also it would impose penalties on people who tried to sell or asked for settlements and so. But here's my larger point here is that if you look at that in and of itself, and you're someone on the left, you say, oh my God, this is just insane. Just like maybe if you're someone on the right and you say $1 trillion to states when they're maybe only out $500 billion, that's insane. And yes, on the surface, absolutely. But the larger point is that, of course, these proposals are essentially opening bids in negotiations, and they know that. So if you ask for just what you want, then you essentially lose all your bargaining power. And I think people forget about that, which is not to say that I wouldn't be thrilled if states got $1 trillion, or, you know, a lot of corporate interests wouldn't be thrilled if they got almost complete liability protection. But both sides understand that that's not where it's going to end up. And I think sometimes in the race to be maximally outraged, people forget about that these policy proposals are, in fact, opening bids and negotiations. And I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yep. And then finally, let's talk about the president's executive order power. This kind of came out of nowhere almost. And it was really...
Again, I just found out about this morning as, again, I was waking up and doing like a quick pre-show run through. But yeah.
And part of it goes into what John Porcher-Memo talks about. He's, of course, has this very, very idiosyncratic reading of the Supreme Court's decision in the DACA case. And to try to really summarize a lot, according to Yu's interpretation, the ruling essentially means that the court said that even if the administration does something outside of the scope of its powers, that action can remain in force for years until all the legal challenges are resolved. And so I sort of agree with him in a way, though I don't think the court was saying that at all. But it's kind of an argument that the president can kind of sort of ignore his constitutional duty to faithfully execute the laws until he's forced to do so, which is that's a pretty bold argument for executive power.
But it is kind of the DACA argument a little bit, isn't it? I mean,
well, it's not actually.
Setting that aside.
It's not actually, because what Justice Roberts wrote in the majority opinion in the DACA ruling was that the administration had to provide some sort of justification for reversing a policy, and just saying, well, we're stopping it because we think it's illegal, that isn't enough. And so it wasn't the court saying to the administration, hey, do illegal stuff and, just wait for it to work its way through the courts. That's so almost nobody really agrees with Yu's view on that, at least legal scholars and so forth, though it's obviously very compelling to President Trump. And we've talked about use of executive orders and so forth. And I think both of us agreed that President Obama overstepped. And actually, President Obama, then DACA, that wasn't an executive order. That was a department memorandum, but it has the same effect.
Right. Executive branch.
Yeah. But I think when I heard that, well, White House negotiators said, well, that's fine. Negotiations broke down. Too bad. But we'll just do this, what we can through executive orders. My initial response was, oh, my God, that's awful. And I assume that's probably your initial response, too.
It is. No, it's awful from a legal standpoint. And I would agree that in most cases, I wouldn't think that the president would have the authority to do what he's proposing.
Yeah, and that's going to be
there's
challenged.
A lot of different things he's proposing, and I think there might be some of those boxes that he probably does have authority to put an order out. But spending new money and so forth, that sort of thing, I think that's probably a non-starter. But I look at this more in the political negotiation part of it, right? And in that way, in some ways, I think it's kind of brilliant, right? He says, "Look, I'm willing to do this and that, and they won't. So I'll go ahead and do it. And you know what, Democrats, if you want to sue me,
which they will,
for doing this, well, okay, you can go ahead and do that, and well, maybe I'll lose. I'll likely lose. But he'll go down on. I mean, I think he makes the political record there. So I get it, and I would agree that I think the presidential authority question on that is probably a loser. But I think politically, it is a winner, and it's part of this negotiation piece and part of this process to bring some pressure on the other side to get this settled, and I think it'll be effective. So,
and one final thing on this I wanted to at least comment on is No, it's interesting to me, and it's kind of sad to me that the negotiations were between the White House and the House. And so, I mean, I get what Mitch McConnell is doing here. He basically doesn't want any part of any of this, wants to, absolve the Senate Republicans of any responsibility. But it just seems to me that Mitch McConnell has gone from a position of saying, well, we want to make sure we know where the president is on these things before we do anything, to essentially outsourcing legislation to the White House. And, maybe politically that makes sense, but I just think it's really sort of a sad commentary on where we're at, where the Senate Majority Leader just basically says, we're not going to legislate. We'll just let the White House take care of that. And that's really depressing and disheartening to me.
I view it a little differently. First of all, there were Senate proposals.
But there was no negotiation. Because the Senate just said, no, we'll let the White House do this.
But
the idea that there are co-equal branches that the Senate legislates, I guess that's just not a thing for Mitch McConnell. There's
also the strategy of good cop, bad cop. And I think
who's bad cop, worse cop, maybe. I'm not sure the good cop is here.
In this case would be Trump.
So you negotiate with the bad cop?
Trump is going to yell and scream about this. He's going to do I'm going to do executive orders. And McConnell at some point I think the strategy would be he could go to the House and say, look, Trump's nuts, but you know what? I think we can get you X, Y, and Z. Will that get the deal done?
When has McConnell ever done that, though?
I think there's a whole lot of kabuki theater here. And it's not that it's anything particularly new. And McConnell also has I think there's the possibility that if this is something that Trump doesn't like, he well could veto it. Again, that's really kind of getting down the path, but that's something you might be more concerned about Trump doing than you would say George Bush doing. I see where you're coming from, but I don't. On the other hand, it's sort of, look, if the Senate was negotiating all of this, there would be people screaming about, why isn't Trump showing more leadership on this relief package?
Sure. I mean, there's a balance to be, and of course, this the fact that the Senate didn't release its proposal until there were literally days for the expiration of this, that I think is also a failure of leadership when the House released its proposal in mid-May, and that's a long time ago.
Well, the House got to have the opening bid.
And the Senate could have responded much sooner than it did. I think it's highly irresponsible for them to have waited for that long, certainly, and there would have been a better chance of something happening. But we're at where we're at. And while I certainly respect Mitch McConnell as a tactician and his abiding interest in keeping the Republican Party in power in the Senate, I think that he has abrogated his responsibility as a legislative leader, and he's never really been much of a legislative leader in any case. So
once again, Mitch, if he's listening, probably just hung his head down and
walk
away in tears. But
I've said it before. I think Donald Trump is who he is, and to a certain extent, while I certainly don't like him, I sort of get who he is and why he is. But Mitch McConnell, I think Mitch McConnell's a far more, in many ways,
your argument is essentially Mitch should know better.
Mitch does know better, and so Mitch, I find Mitch McConnell to be I find Donald Trump to be a broken man, and I find a damaged man. I find Mitch McConnell just to be a reprehensible man, the worst of Machiavellian politics, and I don't want to say despise, but he turns my stomach in so many ways. So there we go.
All right. That said, I think we'll have a deal within the next. By the time we're back from our break, I think there will be a deal.
I don't think that. I hope you're right. I don't think there will be, but I really hope you're right. So we will see. All right. Moving on. Wow, that took a while, but that's okay.
Expect that.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about elections, because there were a bunch of elections this past week in Arizona, Kansas, Michigan, Missouri, Washington, and Tennessee. And I think of particular interest, a couple of things. Number one, the defeat of Chris Kobach in the Kansas Republican U.S. Senate primary, and also the defeat of longtime incumbent Lacey Clay, who lost his St. Louis House Democratic primary to challenger Cori Bush. And then finally, Missouri voters approving Medicaid expansion in a ballot initiative, which will extend benefits to somewhere over 200,000 low-income residents of the state. So 3 things here, all that I think are pretty important going forward. And Jay, let's start with Kansas. This involves your party's primary. Why is Kovach's primary loss generally seen as a positive thing for Senate Republicans going in November?
Well, I think because they're probably thinking that the primary challenger who now won is the better candidate.
Yeah.
That's I mean,
better and being certainly more electable.
There's not a whole lot to dig deeper in that. Look, there's an argument. There are 2 ways to look at this. Sometimes people say primaries are bad because they waste money. They stir up ill will among your voters. They risk alienating some of your voters who then won't go pull the lever for the candidate who eventually wins. In my experience, and you would probably maybe have the research and numbers to show this, that doesn't happen that often. I think voters, especially Republican voters, more so than Democrats, I guess. The old saw, Democrats fall in love, Republicans fall in line. I think there is sort of a thing of, okay, well, we support the candidate who won the primary. I mean, weird exceptions would be like that Alabama race,
Roy Moore, sure,
where the candidate was just god awful for a whole lot of reasons. But I think that's the other side of it is primaries are good for your party in that they vet out, they cull the herd a little bit, and you end up with the stronger candidate who has faced some pressure, has been fully vetted, and is in a better place to run in the general.
Yeah, and in this Kansas Senate seat, I mean, I think that this was, even if Kovach had won, it would have been a lean Republican race or, likely Republican, but it would have at least potentially put it into place. It's a pretty strongly Republican state, in terms of Senate seats, certainly. Now, the House race is a little bit differently on the Democrat side. Lacey Clay had been representing this district since 2001, a black politician whose father represented the district since 1969. So it's been in the Clay family for over 50 years. It's a kind of a local, political dynasty, essentially. And Bush actually ran against Clay in 2018, lost by around 20 points. There was this Netflix documentary that was done after that, which featured AOC and also Bush. That attracted some attention. Bush had got more funding. And of course, at the aftermath of the George Floyd and so forth killings, this was not a case like an AOC of some just like kind of milquetoast, middle of the road kind of conservative Democrat being ousted. Lacey Clay is a very, progressive Democrat and so forth. So this is, I think, a little more surprising. It's not going to matter
not surprising to me.
Well, I mean, it's not going to matter in the sense that this seat was going to go to whoever the Democratic nominee was, no matter what. That's just kind of how most House districts are. But it does possibly move the party. I mean, Clay is a bit more to the left, not colossally more to the left of Clay on certain issues.
More to the left of Clay.
What's that?
Yeah, you said Clay.
Oh, yeah. Bush, yeah, exactly. So Bush is more to the left of Clay. But,
I'd say it matters to Nancy Pelosi.
I think it matters.
And again, maybe not yet, right? Because this is one race, but those races start to add up eventually.
Yeah, and I think we certainly have seen more of that. I think of it in a lot of ways as sort of the Democratic version of the Tea Party thing that we saw on the right, in the wake of in 2010 and going forward, that sort of thing. And so yeah, and certainly primaries are the place where you would see that sort of thing happen, and we've been seeing it in the Democratic Party. A bigger deal, not a bigger deal, but certainly.
Can I just?
Please do.
My observation. And
please do.
This is something that, I had floated a couple weeks ago, and that is that If you are a Democrat, you can never be woke enough. There will always be someone who can out woke you, if you will. And I think this is sort of one of those situations.
Yeah, I think that's true in certain circumstances. It matters more in some districts than others, right? I mean, this is, and so that's just
Right.
kind of how
It's going to be in the more ironically, right, and the more left leaning sort of districts, it's going to be a bigger problem.
right, exactly. Just like on the right, you can say,
As you get
be
closer
more,
to the event horizon of the black hole, you fall even faster.
yeah,
I mean, I think that's
on both sides of things,
Yeah,
certainly, absolutely, yeah, and I certainly agree with that, and that's not something I'm crazy about on either side of it. And then, of course, the Medicaid expansion thing. What's interesting to me about this is that now there have been 6 states that have expanded Medicaid through ballot initiatives since Donald Trump has taken office. And this all kind of comes from something called the Fairness Project, which was this thing, this nonprofit that was started in 2016, came out of a California healthcare workers union. And they decided that they felt that there were a lot of people who really wanted expanded Medicare, but that largely Republican governors and legislatures were not interested in providing that. And so they put a lot of effort into these ballot initiatives. And in fact, every time it's been on the ballot, it's passed, and it's been very, very, very successful. And now there are 12 states currently that have decided to not expand Medicaid. Only 4 of those actually have referendum processes, and those are Florida, Mississippi, South Dakota, and Wyoming. And so of those, Florida is the next kind of big target for this group. And I just think this is a great example of how sometimes on these issues that you can see cases where the legislature and the governor are acting against the public will. And I think this is a case where I'm glad there's a referendum process, especially like in Missouri, where it's done through a constitutional amendment, because in other states where this has been done, it was done through this just kind of standard referendum process, what the governor could do. And the legislature has put like different addendums and revise it so that they could sort of weaken the benefits, whereas in this case, that really can't be done without going back to the people. And so I think this is a very positive development, and I wish the Fairness Project all the best success in Florida in expanding Medicaid benefits to as many people as possible.
So one, there's the policy of Medicaid expansion, and I can see both sides on that. In a lot of ways, I think it is a fiscal time bomb. At least that's what I would have argued, 6 months ago. But to some extent, that the bomb's already gone off, and we are where we are. My bigger concern, I think this goes to more than Medicaid expansion, is putting things into state constitutions by amendment, putting policy pieces into state constitutions by amendment. The problem being, if you have enough money, you can essentially get something in the Constitution, as opposed to, look, if you want to enact the statute by referendum, that's a different situation, because you still have that ability to have the legislature tweak it somewhere down the road, or it's an easier repeal, and especially something like this, Medicaid expansion. It's an easier fix when these are things that need to be adjusted occasionally. And I'm opposed to putting in a brand new. Again, I'm not in Missouri, so it's not my problem. But
I want to agree with you.
I think that's an issue, because that's happened in a lot of states where, and you and I are both sort of small R Republicans, right? So I would say, well, we certainly, I think it's good that there is that safety valve of a referendum or repeal issue if the legislature does something or refuses to do something. I think it's bad precedent to write it into the Constitution.
Yeah. And I will agree with you that it is not ideal, because, as you point out, legislation tends to be, when done correctly, is an iterative process. As you put something into effect, you say, oh, this didn't quite work right. We need to tweak it, as you said, and that's how the process works. And that
referendum also tends to be sort of a blunt instrument.
Yeah, absolutely. And so and this is where you and I will probably disagree, at least we will to a certain extent, if the policy process, the political process weren't so absurdly tilted toward the top 1% in business interest, I would absolutely agree. And in a fairer process, no question that I would oppose this. But the process has become so twisted out of where the public will oftentimes is subverted to a small minority of people who have money, that this is oftentimes the only way to kind of get around that sort of thing. And so my answer to that would be to fix the process so that the public will can be more taken into account, as opposed to a tiny minority of people who just happen to have a lot of money, which is translated into political influence.
Wow. All right. Well, thank you, Jean-Jacques Rousseau there. But, I'd also point out that, look, running these statewide referendum is not cheap.
No, not at all.
That's I think the big concern is you can have some moneyed interests.
Yeah.
I don't think saying that somehow a referendum is somehow more pure than the other processes. I just don't see that.
I think it's more pure because after the fact, when the legislation is all done, then there's the behind the scenes sort of in the legislative lobbies where the interests kind of go to work, and there's not the public attention, and it's easy to make those sort of tweaks or adjustments that almost nobody knows about, and they tend to favor far more the moneyed interest than the public, which isn't necessarily being told about these things. So.
But I'm going to push back a little bit on when you say that the lobbyists and so forth. Again, a lot of times I think lobbyists get painted with a broad brush and wrongfully, because a lot of times the people who are doing the lobbying on either side are, and you would appreciate this, the experts on the issue, right? And they can say, hey, look, this referendum piece, as it's drafted, this constitutional amendment as it's drafted, is a really blunt instrument. And if passed this way, it'll screw up X, Y, and Z and have these other consequences that maybe the drafters have not fully thought out. And I think that's what's important is the legislative process rather than the referendum process, because the referendum process can be just an easy, hey, we want X, and hey, now it's in the Constitution. So, yeah, I think the money's a problem either way, and if anything, the money's more of a problem in a referendum than it is in regular legislation.
Yeah, and that would be a subject
I think
for
your
a
dogs
much.
would agree with me.
That would be subject for
them shouting. Yes,
what's that?
Jay's right, and I think your dogs would agree with me.
Yeah. The Amazon truck just came, and so if you hear that in the background, there is a whole lot of craziness going on. So it's been coming a lot more. My birthday's in a couple of days, and so I'm hoping there's cool stuff for me. I'm in favor of some capitalism. Anyway, but yeah, that is definitely subject for a much deeper, I think, and longer conversation. But we'll hold that for another time, and I think that pretty much does it for us today. But before we end, let's have our recommendations for this week. And actually, I want to recommend something from the conservative side. I recently started subscribing to the Bulwark's daily newsletter. It's a conservative website, and it's a great website. I like the newsletter even better because it's just a handy way to get sort of what I would consider a rational, reasonable, conservative view on a wide variety of topics. The Bulwark started in 2018, and they say they're dedicated to, how do they put it, providing political analysis and reporting free from the constraints of partisan loyalties or tribal prejudices. Now, that said, they are definitely an organ of conservative thought, but I found that their authors, their writers have a lot of interesting viewpoints, and I don't always agree with them, but I almost always appreciate what they're bringing to the debate. And so I would say if you are someone of the left who has struggled to find a conservative news source, aside from Jay, of course, and Kristen and Trey.
I'm not available.
Yeah. I think it's worth checking out. And like I said, the nice thing about the newsletter, it just pops up and you can scan the top articles. And I found it to be very worthwhile. And so that is my recommendation for this week. Jay, what do you have?
So I'm reading a book by Princeton historian Sean Willents called No Property in Man. At least as far as I know, he's still with Princeton. They haven't canned him yet. But it is a, sort of a pre-rebuttal. The book was written in 2018, but it almost serves as sort of like I said, a pre-rebuttal of a lot of the 1619 project stuff. The thesis of the 1619 project is that, I will condense it briefly, but that the country was all about slavery, was founded for slavery and keeping slavery, and that's the central point, and the Constitution was about slavery. Willens points out, makes a really good argument, I think, in that the drafters of the Constitution were well aware of the evils of slavery and worked to create its eventual demise, put things in motion that would end slavery. A lot of this is based on Madison's notes, which were not released until after his death. So there's this weird period in American history going up to the Civil War where, I'm sorry, it was maybe 50 years after Madison's death even. But they weren't available at the time. A lot of folks like your John C. Calhouns and your Pickerings were making arguments that, hey, this is what the founders intended was slavery. But his big point is so much of where slavery is mentioned, there were big fights to avoid, one, the word slavery or the word slaves, and talk about persons. And that was sort of setting the table because there were so many delegates who did not want any sort of recognition or blessing of slavery in the text of the Constitution, while at the same time realizing the political will, if they're going to have a constitution, they couldn't. There were concessions that had to be made to get the southern states on board. But anyway, it's fascinating, and I think it's a great look at a great rebuttal to this argument that we are somehow a racist nation from our very birth, and irretrievably flawed and so forth.
Yeah. Sounds interesting. And again, that along with the bullet link will be in the show notes. Also, I wanted to mention that there were a number of things that we didn't get to today that we will kind of move over to our supporters exclusive Wednesday show. And that's, we hadn't talked about the TikTok issue, and we'll get into that, as well as more on voting by mail and kind of a change in message by President Trump and sort of the intricacies of that maybe. And possibly we'll also get into some listener mail questions as well. And again, if you are a supporter, that will be in your, you'll be getting that at some point. Wednesday, I think, is when it comes. Yeah, it drops on Wednesday. I should know this. I do it. Anyway, that will be there in your feed. If you're not, just sign up to become a supporter, patreon.com/politics guys. And again, remember, please, if you can't afford to become a supporter, it's really no big deal. I'm happy to set you up with these midweek episodes. Just email me, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get you taken care of. Also, if you haven't already subscribed to the show, that really does help us out, as do ratings and reviews, and also especially sharing episodes on social media, email, however you want to do it, carrier pigeon, you name it. And if you want to get in touch with us, mail to politicsguys.com. Check out our bipartisan politics subreddit and our Facebook page in the show notes there. And finally, a special thanks to our executive producers, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Chris Wilkerson, and Nathan Sosnowski. Today's show was produced by me, Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show, a different kind of show, as I mentioned, next week, and then our next regular show 2 weeks from now. We hope you'll join us.